Excellent. I'm sure people will keep drifting in here. So I just want to say from the outset that I'm gonna talk for half an hour, 40 minutes to try and leave some time for us to talk openly and informally. And I can tell you right off the bat that so here I have this very dramatic title, right? Climate Change and the Future of Christianity. So let me take some of the drama out of that from the beginning. My basic thesis is that climate change is the sort of problem that forces moral traditions to make their way of life competent to unexpected responsibilities. Never before has humanity thought it had a responsibility, a practical responsibility for the sky, and to unexpected moral relationships, to practical obligations across generations, to obligations that are mediated by atmospheric systems across geographies. Those are unexpected and unprecedented conditions, and so it's the sort of problem that forces Christianity and any other tradition of a deep way of life to invent ways to make itself competent to meet the basic everyday challenges of what it means in these kinds of conditions. Now, if we think about climate change as that kind of problem, it refocuses the way that it should address itself to the problem. It's less a matter of using our moral authority to call the rest of the world to do better, that the nations ought to cooperate, that people ought to change their ways of life. Our first task, I submit, lies in inventing possibilities of everyday responsibility, of making climate justice something you could actually live, of loving neighbors across generations and geographies through atmospheric systems, a feasible possibility. For what the world lacks is definitely not urgent calls to action. What it lacks are possibilities of shared and meaningful everyday action. Now, it's important, of course, to understand the basic science of climate change. I'm not going to review very much of it this morning, but I'm happy to do so afterwards if you want to talk about target thresholds and scientific uncertainties. I'm happy to do so. I think it's enough to say that our atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide are about a third more than they were from pre-industrial levels, that this is already causing significant impacts, and that the risk of impacts to the generation of my one-year-old son are quite serious indeed, and that there will be whatever kind of stabilization or policy that the world eventually stumbles into, we will never stabilize our greenhouse gases until our total emissions are less than what the trees and the oceans can sink. That's it. I think that's probably enough to get ourselves going in some kind of sense of what then should we do. Okay. So climate impacts, they include things like stressed agriculture, yes, and spreading diseases, and loss of a third to as many as a half of the other kinds of life. But here's the most perilous one, that humanity's accidental ecological powers have begun to exceed our ethical competency, exceed our capacities of responsibility. Our ideas and institutions of justice seem inadequate to responding to climate change, and the meaning of Christian ideas about loving enemies and neighbors seems uncertain when our relationships to one another are mediated by atmospheric systems, separated by geographies, by generations, and when the relative moral agencies involved are as dispersed and difficult to track as the gases in the atmosphere. So we face more than a technical problem of managing emissions, and more than an economic problem of measuring costs and benefits, and more even than a political problem of getting difficult nations to negotiate into a feasible treaty. We face a cultural problem. A basic pattern of human life seems unsustainable. And that calls into question the competency of the moral ideas and practices that are part of that life. The moral ideas and practices that we use to keep our powers responsible to some shared sense of humanity, however minimal. many different kinds of climate critics are saying something like this, that the fundamental challenge here is a moral one, an ethical one. But meeting the challenge of climate change is not just about doing the right thing or choosing the moral path. Facing the ethical challenge here, I'm arguing, means trying to make our communities, our traditions, our cultures, our faith survive by becoming capable of meeting new problems. For a practical example, climate change does not just cause injustice, it also makes our concepts and institutions of justice unreliable, which makes it difficult to name just how there is injustice involved, which adds to the kinds of disagreements and confusions that we have. So in the moral conditions of climate change, how will we renegotiate the ideas, the practices, the stories that sustain our humanity? For Christianity, how will our tradition keep calling people to love neighbors and enemies, keep calling people to love justice, when it's difficult to say just what concretely that means? Climate change is a wicked problem. Like many sustainability problems, it's a structurally wicked problem in that what would count as a solution is somewhat indeterminate, scientifically indeterminate and culturally indeterminate. Should global humanity aim at 350 parts per million or 450 parts per million? The Bolivian People's Congress says it should be returned to pre-industrial levels, 280 parts per million. There's no definite solution that will solve the problem by reverting the atmospheric system to a state when humanity had no influence over it. No matter how successfully and robustly we respond to climate change, it will not go away. It is an enduring condition of responsibility. It's an enduring condition of responsibility whose interpretation depends on our ideas, the ideas that we bring to it, the stories that we bring to it. So it's a cultural space. Our atmosphere has become a cultural space for figuring out what our traditions mean to us. Structurally wicked problems are different from morally wicked problems. That's an important distinction because structurally wicked problems are not necessarily caused by evil people and evil empires. Religious thinkers and Christian thinkers especially sometimes do talk that way, as if climate change were the outcome of evil societies. And sometimes that leads us to welcome our ethical incompetency as the sign of a cultural exhaustion that shows that the coming collapse of Babylon is upon us, or as some Christian ethicists have said, the kingdom of oil is collapsing. The coming of the end of the global North's empire, of human domination over the earth, of the industrial captivity of Christianity. My own view is more moderate, and it's more difficult. Climate change is indeed caused by a kind of dominating human empire, but it's an unexpected one, more unwitting accident than political project. And despite there's enough bad acting going on. Yes, the United States negotiating has been odiously indefensible. Yes, energy corporations have been intentionally obfuscatory. Yes, there is dishonesty built into the structure of our high carbon lifestyles. Yes. But climate change doesn't just reduce to evil action. It's a cumulative, unintended outcome of everyday life across the planet, of your travel here, of our breakfast, of this presentation, this PowerPoint. The causes of its harms are multiple, they're indirect, and they're dispersed through time and space. So deciding what must be done, it's not enough to say, well, we must seek justice. We must, yes. But doing so depends on social creativity to invent possibilities of what can be done. How might we collectively modify our influence within the world's atmospheric system? What commitments would allow a pluralist world to cooperate with one another? How to allocate responsibilities across relations of inequality and injustice? How to allocate emissions, which is to say, how to allocate entitlements to use atmospheric space among rich and poor? How should we meet together? How should we eat our breakfast? How should we make presentations? If Christian ethics, or religious ethics, any kind of ethic, avoids reckoning with those questions by supposing that the failures are all attributable to sin and evil, to some injustice in our heart, it refuses the most difficult aspect of responsibility, the struggle to invent concrete social practices that begin to make us capable of answering those questions. Again, it's not about inventing solutions. It's about inventing practices that begin to make us capable of answering the questions posed by the challenge of climate change. So, surprising counsel. Religious ethics should confess uncertainty, not use its authority. So far, most official religious responses to climate change, which are hearteningly widespread and in most nearly every Christian denomination and all over the religious spectrum, most of them have responded in what may be an unhelpful way, by using their authority, their moral authority, to affirm that there is indeed a problem. Climate change is real and you should take it seriously, and the nations should cooperate with one another. Calling on politicians and nations to do better seems to evade the real challenge. Climate change renders uncertain and unstable the moral concepts that we use to decide how to cooperate with one another. That we decide what fairness means and justice means. We struggle to say what loving neighbors looks like concretely in a time of climate change, or how faithfulness to the Creator takes shape in these conditions, or what justice would look like in shared political and ecological participation. So if we use religious language to call on global politics to do better, we might just add religious pressure to an already difficult situation and add to the kinds of disagreements that people can have. But uncertainty is not cause for despair. I've emphasized several times now that climate change renders uncertain our shared meaning, our Christian ideas of justice and love. That's reason for hope. Uncertainty drives adaptive change in religious traditions. Because they conserve stories and cultivate practices that interpret the meaning of life, when a new problem outstrips the practical competency of a religious ethic, it poses a crisis of authority for its tradition. Its stories become uncertain. Our way of life is there's something agitatively uncertain and vague. So communities of that tradition must create a way to extend its interpretation of life to a new context. Or to put it more simply, Christian communities must figure out a way to extend the way of following Jesus to the context of climate change. So it's not vague, uncertain. Traditions endure by producing change. They're not static repositories of belief and symbols. They're embodied patterns of life, the meaning of which is carried on through ongoing response to their context. Over the long run, traditions will sustain meaning for their members only if they make possible a pattern of living in the midst of new existential, social, political, and ecological problems. At the heart of live religious traditions, then, is a sustainability logic by which the tradition reproduces its way of life for a changing world. So confessing that climate change poses challenges that make us uncertain about how to concretely live out love, justice, and faith opens a gap that begins to exert pressure on our faith communities to invent practices that sustain the meaning of our gospel by proving what it can do in new conditions. So we can begin from creative reform projects. The task of Christianity's response to climate change, the future of Christianity and climate change, does not have to begin from official theologians and denominational centers and prestigious theological schools. You need not await an authoritative report from YDS on the meaning of agape in times of climate change. We're awaiting what you're going to do, as a matter of fact. It's the other way around. Religions are always more and different than their formal beliefs about the world because they are carried and embodied in the practitioners who draw on traditions to meet the problems of everyday life. In the face of climate change, there are already in every tradition and culture reform projects that attempt to sustain the beliefs and practices of their community by making them capable of interpreting a new problem and sustaining a way of life in the midst of it. Those efforts are chronically inadequate, in part because most of our moral traditions are, like I said earlier, structurally incompetent to meet a problem with such complexity and novelty. Not to worry. Reform projects work to make that gap between what it can do, the reform it has generated, the interpretation it has extended, and the complexity of the problem. They make that gap a source of normative creativity, expanding the meaning and competency of their tradition through ongoing innovative ways of practicing. So the relevance of Christianity to climate change is contingent on the moral creativity of reform projects that pulse with the heartbeat of Christian life. If following Jesus comes to demand breaking with high-energy American ways of life, then Christianity begins to matter to a pluralist world looking for ways to live in the time of climate change. Climate change puts Christianity at risk because life in Christ appears uncertain. What does love of enemies mean when enmity is mediated by atmospheric systems? How to follow a liberating Savior when our everyday commute is part of an accidental empire? The way that Christian communities respond to those questions determines the meaning of our ideas and practices of love and justice and faith. There's an important confession regarding climate change that came from the South African Council of Churches that includes this sentence. It is now becoming clear that climate change concerns more than an ethical issue. It is also a matter where the content and significance of the Christian faith are at stake. So the South African Council of Churches made a confession in both senses. We appear to have a way of life that is out of joint with what the world requires, and that requires us to reaffirm, reconfess the central meaning of our faith. Meaningful Christian responsibility happens then not as the application of ideals from Christian life to a problem at hand, but as that life itself. As that life itself. So, Christian ethics can begin from a description of reality that poses that daunting gap between the problem and our apparent capacities of response, and suppose that God confronts us anew in our experience of that gap. Christian communities become answerable for the reality of climate change when they recognize how it renders uncertain the way that we are living the faith, and when we receive that uncertainty as God's call upon us, God's call to renew, to rediscover. Confessing moral uncertainty that way opens a tradition to the sort of risk that can generate imaginative, realistic, missional possibilities of living the faith. So, there's my best attempt to suggest that Christian communities have, despite our incompetency, a great theological source for responding to the gap between a problem and our faith. And doing so, we can demonstrate to a world that faces a very similar gap with other kinds of traditions and other kinds of shared stories and practices, how to receive that gap as a source. Okay, but now here's the difficulty. One ethicist has described climate change as a perfect moral storm, by which he means there are multiple features that come together that are stacked against meaningful response. It's as if you wanted to respond to climate change, there are three different ways in which our attempts are being defeated. I'm going to quickly explain what they are, because it's important to realize this is what the reality is that inventiveness must meet. I don't want to make it seem so complex that a very basic picture is missed. There are other ethicists who would say, look, we basically have a problem of kindergarten ethics. Someone has made a mess and someone should clean it up. And I'm sympathetic to that basic picture. But it's difficult. climate change is in kindergarten in some ways that I just suggested. It's the cumulative, indirect outcome. Making breakfast in the morning is not inherently mess making unless it's a part of a billion other people doing the same thing in some received infrastructure. So, yes and no. All right, here are some moral storms. Bill McKibben, when he wrote the first popular book about climate change, entitled it The End of Nature. And that's probably true in a way he didn't mean. He meant, now that human action is influencing the entire planet, you can never go and find a piece of nature that is untouched by humanity in the North American ideal of what nature is. Yeah, he's probably right about that, and maybe that idea of nature was never a good one to start off with. But nonetheless, we don't have any idea of nature to which we can appeal to solve the problem. You can't just do the natural thing in this case. What is the natural level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? 280 parts per million, 350, 450, 175. Well, we have no other recourse but to try and decide together with feedback, science-based feedback from ecological systems, and all kinds of feedback from many different cultures about what sort of planet we want to live in, what sort of people we want to be. It's complicated. I've already mentioned that complexity and liability. Clearly, North American high-carbon society is more at fault than others. But precisely ascribing fault is difficult. It's not inherently wrong to burn carbon fuels for energy. That's what our bodies do when we inhale. It becomes wrong within cumulative, aggregate, intergenerational actions. It has become wrong to use energy as we do because generations before us did. And so there's an inherited stock of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that have begun to cause a problem. So we have a problem of participation. There's perverse global asymmetry, which is to say, the greatest current emitters often face the least costs to climate change, and those who have done almost nothing to contribute to it face the highest costs. This seems almost diabolically perverse. There are island nations that will likely cease to exist and are already making arrangements to move their populations elsewhere, and their entire historical emissions are almost nothing. So this is not just, and this is the point I want to make clear here. You've heard that before. It's not just that is unfair, but that asymmetry defeats not the possibility, but it creates an obstacle to coming together and seeing shared ideas of justice. North American negotiators just don't have an interest in seeing that claim of justice because the costs are so much less to North American society. Significant, yes. Life from my son's generation will be more difficult and costly, likely because of climate change. But the waters are not going to rise over top of us as they are for the Maldives. And this is true for indigenous peoples as well, who are saying similar things. Look, our way of life contributes almost nothing to greenhouse gas emissions, and our way of life is threatened with extinction. Perverse intergenerational asymmetry. Most of the worst risks are for my son's generation and the generation after that. And the costs for averting them would come to our generation, this one. Every generation will inherit that disincentive structure. It's always better to defer the problem to the next generation. And that will always increase the problem for the next generation. So again, it's not impossible, but there's an obstacle to creating forms of response. And finally, we have to discuss these things not only in a pluralist world, but a world of radical inequality. And radical inequality that is interpreted in different ways, so that there's serious alienation between the global north and the global south. And you can see it especially in our own hemisphere, between North American and South American interpretations of climate change. They're massively different. And they're massively different because of different interpretations of the global market and how the global market has produced opportunity, North American view, or produced exploitative inequality, South American view. So we have to arrive at shared ideas of justice, or at least what would count as a minimally fair response to climate change within these inherited conditions of inequality and alienation. Okay, so those are the storms, and they all come together, and they attempt to defeat our shared capacities to do something. So, I'm going to quickly say something about how Christians have responded. The important thing here is that these features of climate change show the concrete challenges that any ethic, any religious ethic, any Christian ethic, has to overcome, has to meet. In the face of a perfect moral storm that corrupts possibilities for shared responsibility, I don't think our best move is to add religious pressure to the situation. A competent religious ethic must demonstrate practical possibilities of acting that begin to overcome those defeating features of the problem. How to invent possibilities of agency that show that justice is possible across our inequalities, that begin to imagine how intergenerational obligation might take form, that take account of the way that the costs and the risks of climate change fall asymmetrically, geographically and economically. It seems daunting, but I think that religious organizations, religious memberships, and Christian communities in particular have a great opportunity here. Like other global religions, Christian memberships exist across many of the boundaries that most alienate us: global north and global south, rich and poor, Bolivian and North American. Christian memberships are shaped by an intergenerational pattern of hastening to wait for what God brings, by a story that God acts to reconcile all creation. So Christianity as a membership sits in the midst of those storms with some potential for responding to them. All right, let me quickly say something about these strategies, and then close and we can talk. So the popular one in North America, avoidance. I think they're right about something. Climate change does indeed pose a risk to certain Christian ways of life. So better not to see the problem if you have no principle of solution for it. Apocalyptic, this is good and bad. You know the climate kind of apocalyptic that talks about runaway climate change and tipping points, and makes it seem as if the world is basically already beyond our control and we can do no other but wait for the coming collapse. There's a theological version of that interprets this coming collapse in light of the world's future in God, and so awaits the end of the kingdom of oil. I mean, the difficulty, of course, with apocalyptic thinking is when it's awkwardly done, it can defeat our incentive for acting and our ability for shared action. Prophetic politics. This is using our moral authority, our ideas about justice and love to call for particular policies and action. Totally needed, but with the danger that if it looks like our ideas of justice just reduce to a moderate cap and trade policy, then you can lose some of that prophetic power, and so you need some of that apocalyptic imagination. Here's the strategy that I've been plugging this whole time: missional strategies that use climate change to reconfigure Christian practices. I think that we do need something of all four of those strategies. We need political realism, real policies. We need the imaginative power of apocalyptic strategies. And we need that sense of risk that's in the avoidance strategies, all in a negative way. But let me say something about these missional strategies as I close. I've said that the incompetency of Christian ethics to climate change can be experienced as the gap between who we are and who God calls us to become. The struggle to respond concretely and definitely is the struggle to understand how to respond to God's action for us. And then that's quite concrete. That's as concrete as World Vision beginning to build climate adaptation into its mission of poverty relief. That's a sign. Here's a major mission agency of Christian membership that has begun to figure out how climate change matters for its core mission of caring for the poor. It's not making climate change its core mission, but it's adapting and rediscovering how climate change matters for what its mission is. It's inadequate. It's insufficient. And it can make it look like, because it's based around some offsetting and sequestration schemes, it can make it look like there's a major, mostly North American agency that is sort of creating moral cover for the high carbon lifestyles of North Americans, which the Latin American Council of Churches has said. But that's great. There's a real dialogue. There's some real deliberation that's happening. Here our ideas of justice are beginning to become competent. And here are practices in which we can learn to think. Here are practices that we can learn to think with, practices that begin to make us capable of answering the questions of how justice matters for climate change. Where's God in this climate predicament? Practices like that, they imply that God is not the promise of rescue from ourselves. God is not the promise that we will not face the consequences of our ways of life. God keeps doing what God always does. God calls people into confession, into repentance, into a way of life that does justice and loves enemies. God reconciles us to one another, to creation, to God. In conditions of climate change, that constant act of grace just becomes incarnate in new and perhaps strange ways. Oops, what did I do? Now, Vatican. The Vatican has begun to, 2 years ago, they purchased offsets for the entire emissions of Vatican City. Offsets are very controversial. They're controversial for scientific reasons, for economic reasons, for moral reasons. It's not certain, how they really affect the carbon cycle. It's not certain how effective they are in setting a price on carbon, which is key to adjusting everyday behavior. And morally, some people call offsets indulgences, which in the Vatican, right? Yeah. Which in the Vatican case is controversial to call it indulgences, but also really interesting, isn't it? Yeah. That the Vatican has to own up or has to respond to this charge that offsetting is essentially a form of cheap grace, of buying your way out of a problem. Mm-hmm. And the response might be, well, yeah, there's some vulnerability there. You can see how it might become that. But here's a way in which the Vatican can voluntarily begin to take responsibility for the real social and ecological costs of their energy infrastructure, which was the point of what they wanted to do. I mean, the answer can't be, I'm just not going to recognize that there are social and ecological costs. And there are other Christian groups that have done this. Have begun to do things like voluntary carbon taxing or voluntary carbon tithing. Kansas Interfaith Power and Light, I hear, does it, and there are some Mennonite groups who do it. They meet together and they self-assess a carbon tax, sometimes by deciding, in different means, different incomes, what would an appropriate tax be, and then they pool their money into a common fund and they disperse it by some agreement as to what would be a missional way or a just way of dispersing it. It's showing a willingness to bear the costs of our everyday life, even if we can't change the power plant that our energy comes from. And again, it's controversial. Others say that's just not the way to go. That we should instead be actively focused on changing our ways of life, withdrawing from these high carbon lifestyles. Archbishop Rowan Williams called for a carbon fast in the 2011 Lent. Maybe asceticism is the right way to go. This is a former student who graduated in 2011, Scott Clausen. He's on a one-year bike ride across the United States using essentially no fossil fuel carbon. A carbon Sabbath, he calls it. He's going from faith community to faith community, talking with people about how Christians and other forms of community can respond to climate change. So here's a kind of a combination of the asceticism and the pilgrimage. And there might be political things to do. There are students who have been joint degrees at Yale Divinity School and the Forestry School, joint degree students at the two schools, have gone to the climate negotiations in Copenhagen and Cancun, in part to assist countries who are outgunned by China and the United States. China and the United States will bring hundreds of negotiators, in part to make the negotiations so confusing that no one else can really participate in them. So YDS and FES have been sending students to help the understaffed countries at least be able to track what's going on with all the policy proposals. And this is an Anglican climate justice initiative that some of us from YDS went to last year, in which there were the Bishop of California and a number of bishops from South America got together to discuss what justice would look like across some of the divisions that alienate us. And it was a very promising meeting. Again, I think that that's some of the most promising work that's being done in the Christian membership. You'll see here on the right, there's Stephanie Johnson, who, oh, she's here this morning. Stephanie is you're the Carbon Stewardship Coordinator. Is that what's your title? Yes, for the Northeastern Episcopal Churches. And among the several kinds of projects that she wants to do is try and start climate dialogue like that through companion diocese relationships. In those kinds of inventive, adaptive responses, I think we can say, here God is creating a renewed community, reconciling us across those inequalities of power and wealth, south and north, maybe even humanity and the rest of creation. And that reconciliation takes shape through a movement of little projects that attempt to embody, however insufficiently, however incompetently, how God gathers humanity across its alienations into a restored membership of all creation. When the moral membership of the church begins to take shape in the midst of climate change, it exhibits those social and ecological relations in which responsibility for the biosphere becomes possible, in which we begin to become capable of responding. Okay, so now we can talk. We have about 15 minutes, I guess, until you have to go somewhere. So, yes.
Thank you. I'd like to have you share with us how you would go about seeking common ground with two persons whose perspective is quite different from your own. First being a Southern Baptist who believes in the moral authority of the Bible. And the second, a Chinese scientist who's not a theist, not an adherent of any religion, but on the Chinese Government Council for Climate Change.
Sure. Yeah, the first one's not so hard because there's a young Southern Baptist pastor who was concerned that the Southern Baptist Convention was responding in a knee-jerk way to climate change and seeing it as cultural politics. And basically undertook a study with the Southern Baptist Convention about how the Bible speaks to climate change. And the Southern Baptist Convention came out with a statement on climate change that was not altogether bad, actually. It came out last year about that. Not to say that every Southern Baptist thinks that, not at all. But here, what it took was precisely that someone who was perceived by this community as an authoritative interpreter of its tradition showed how a central belief in that tradition, the moral authority of the Bible, was not, how that belief could be reaffirmed and strengthened through response to climate change. So I think that things like that have to happen in all different kinds of ways in all different kinds of communities. For the Chinese scientist, the Chinese scientist is a member of the negotiating party.
Yeah, he's on the government commission there. Yeah. He's not a theist. He's not an adherent of any religion.
Sure. Yeah. I think that the Chinese certainly recognize that climate change is happening and serious. So the task there is creating shared agreement on what fair teamwork looks like with the United States, African countries, European countries. So I think it's a different kind of challenge, and I would say that we know what the Chinese are worried about. They're worried that their economic growth is going to be saddled at just the point of taking off, at just the point of taking off poverty. And it's going to be saddled because of the historical decisions of the high carbon society. I think it will take Americans who are willing to say, we are willing to bear accountability for our historic and present emissions in order to make an agreement that it has fair teamwork involved. But what we're not willing is to have sort of voluntary commitments to everyone. I mean, you need, for fair teamwork, you need to have China as a nation involved with coercive devices. But I don't think that we can treat China as as a giant that is going to overwhelm the atmosphere, as if we have not created the conditions that let that happen. I mean, there's a lot of talk about China's growing, monstrously growing emissions, which is true to one extent, but it's important to remember that U.S. per capita emissions are about 20 tons a person, and in China they're still about 5. So if we think about, if we were to think in a cosmopolitan way about equal per capita entitlements to atmospheric space, we could probably come away with an agreement in which the United States ended up with a disproportionately higher agreement. So maybe China would grant us, 12 or 15 per person, and they would commit to 8 or 10. That might account for everything working. So anyway, that's all to say. What I think we need is honest discussions about where we are and what we think fairness amounts to. What we have now are sovereign powers who are just bluntly running into each other and asserting their sovereign right to put carbon in the atmosphere. That's not going to help. I mean, we need the possibility of discussion about fairness. Do you have a follow-up?
It's often seen that Christian denominations come to this issue primarily are riding on other moral waves and on scientific information that they themselves have not generated.
Sure.
I'm wondering, are there things that you see that are unique and peculiar to a Christian as they come into this discussion? Is there something unique that a Christian should bring that would not be necessarily brought by the Chinese scientists?
Yeah. Presumably, we love justice. And presumably, we're willing to try and incarnate it. And presumably, we scorn the worldly differences of nation and gender and race and class in shaping what we think about justice looks like. So you would think that we would body towards some of the most exciting things in response to climate change. And that's why I think that something like that Anglican Climate Justice Initiative is so interesting. Because where you would think that a leader in California and a leader of Bolivia would be at the far ends of the spectrum, when they're Christian, they have a shared language and a shared worship, a shared faith and a shared liturgy. And it shows that there are deeper forms of community and deeper wells of possibility for response. I certainly don't think that Christians should try and generate their own description of the problem. I think sometimes there is in evangelical and conservative Christianity a worry that they have not generated the science-based description of the problem. And a number of evangelical communities came on board when John Houghton, who was one of the original chairs of the IPCC, let it be known that he's an evangelical Christian, and he came talking about his own commitments and his own to attest to the reality of climate change. That sort of made it better. So, but I'm not sure that that's. This may not be what you were saying at all, but just off my thinking. I'm not sure that that's what our worry should be. Our worry should be how do we live out faith in these conditions?
Perhaps with a moral way in which the Christian concern is not only to preserve the life of future generations, but is rather to honor the Creator. And that to honor the Creator and protect the Creator's gift to us, then this is in a different dimension.
And this is what's really, I think, also very interesting about intergenerational care. So sustainability is one of the concepts that we use to think about intergenerational obligation, but it has this, this basic question: what should we sustain? Why? And sometimes it seems that the answer is implicit, but not certain. That we should sustain our survival, that we should sustain our way of life, that we should sustain our power. The Christian intergenerational membership doesn't care about either of those things. It wants to sustain our worship of the Creator. The one intergenerational thing that we have is our liturgy. What we sustain is the possibility to keep worshiping. So maybe I'm not sure what that. I shy away from saying that because I don't have a liturgical imagination. I can't say exactly what that looks like. Maybe it's just to say that we keep doing what we've always done, and this is what it means in this new situation. That's a possibility. But I think that your point is It's a really important one, and it's one that has not been fully developed or articulated yet. We've been so anxious to affirm, yes, Christians also say that this is a morally important problem. Yes, probably a sin. But what is our distinctive witness around it, and from which practices does that witness come? Less that.
Thank you very much for your very thoughtful, analytical, and contextual ethical attempts. I once, with the rest of the class of 1961, 50 years ago, sat in these areas of the Divinity School of the Church of Niebuhr, and I'm reminded, thank you very much for the resonation of his thought of the complexity of ethical decision-making, and yet how do we overcome being paralyzed by the complexity so that we actually do something? My thought about the negative side of it is the unintended consequences we get into. I heard Dr. Gibbons speak recently in Maine, and one of the things he said was the problem is going solar with all the photovoltaic cell creation is that it may take more energy to create them than in fact they do all during their lifetime. So all of a sudden you try it for something that's a goal and it turns out to bite you. So I was thinking about why I have been involved a little bit in acts of efforts to think about climate change myself. As I say, I live in Maine, and I've gotten involved in the land trust movement there, and found there colleagues in an evangelical way for conservation and preservation of what we call in Maine special places, and the sense of habitat being extremely precious for the rookeries for birds and the raising of juvenile lobsters and clams and all of that is vital for what we think of as a special place. And we speak in a sort of secular language there about a sacred dimension. And most of my colleagues and friends in the conservation world, I think, are not much involved in the Christian tradition. But it is the sense of beauty, the sense of the special place that I think has motivated me. Along with that is some fear of, let's say, health consequences for myself, my grandchildren, people. If we get to a climate change where asthma is, all of those fear issues. So we have, I need to look at some of the things that motivate me and perhaps to motivate others to actually not be paralyzed by the complexity. And I'd like your thoughts about what you think are other avenues of practical outcome-oriented ethical actions.
Sure. Thank you for that question. Can we have one more question? Yes.
Practical resources for congregations and pastors. That's my question.
All right, one more question. That's too hard. I'll answer that one.
I appreciate that you're talking about that climate change is not the result of evil people or even necessarily the result of sin. It's unintended consequences. But in this political climate, what do we do when absolute property rights are asserted by Christians as if there's no consequences that are that one can be held accountable?
I think that, yes, I mean that. I think that Christians in North America have a peculiar responsibility. And it's, the task is exceptionally difficult because the loudest voices, I don't think all the majority voices, but certainly the loudest voices, are obstreperous, reality denying, and they assert with theological certainty some of the strangest beliefs that, that property rights are sovereign to human beings. I mean, really. So I guess I just have to say, I think that Christians in North America, we have to find ways to bear that. Bear our colleagues in faith here, bear what we disagree with. And that may mean that I think that probably does mean finding forms of confession, appropriate forms of confession. I don't want to, environmentalists are often for, performing guilt. Not about performing guilt, but confession in the proper theological sense. Of servicing what we think is wrong in order that those conflicts can come out and be dealt with theologically and be dealt with beyond our borders. To this point, and partly to your question, I mentioned this South African Council of Churches document. I think it's one of the best theological responses I've yet seen, and it came about from a real gathering of people from rich and poor, black and white, all the colors of South Africa. So South Africa exists across, it's a little microcosm of all the alienations of the world around climate change. And they have these elements of attempting to bear witness and to bear confession, and to also figure out some practical ways forward. Perhaps it's a model for how communities might begin to respond to this. And I could staple other things, but let me ask you to find Stephanie in the back, since this is her job. She's supposed to be able to tell us how to practice. How can you get back to the work on these things? I know that you need to get to something else, so have a good day.
Thank you.
Sure.